All right, supposedly we are live, and hello, and welcome to the Aureus Pressure Cast once more. And today I have Mr. Robert Stark. Now, Mr. Stark is someone I have seen online off and on for a long time now. It doesn't feel like a long time. It feels like it's been like 6 months, but when I examined it in my brain, I realized that I've just seen you on the internet or heard you off and on for what must be more than 10 years now, more like 12, I guess. I don't know. I remember you
Oh yeah, yeah.
back in the
Great
early
being
days, the
on.
glory
So
days.
you're saying that
Go on, yeah.
you've been following me for quite some time before we interacted on Twitter.
Well, even if I wasn't following you, you would appear. Oh, there's Robert Stark again. Oh, there he is again over there, and you just be there. You just be there somehow. I don't know, because in the old days, well, everyone was like on Facebook or something. I don't know, and maybe like I didn't even start using Twitter till 2018 or something. But you would just appear on people's podcasts or here and there, and you'd always have something interesting to say. So I just thought, no, he's still there. So I must finally talk to him or hear his opinion on these things because you do always have an opinion on something. It seems like, and you do have lots of near future. It sounds like sort of predictive stuff, especially about the economy. So in fact, I'm just going to list off quickly the topics that you suggested we talk about, and I don't know if we'll get to them all, but they were economy, signs of a hard landing, mostly due to debt, architectural and aesthetic vibe shift for 2020s, new optimism, even if unfounded after pandemic, economic and demographic trends in California. That's dicey for you to maybe, well, we can do it. Why no collapse is the real dystopia? Now that's something I'd really like to get your opinion on. The case for right-wing multiculturalism over civic nationalism. Now that sounds crazy, rebuilding social capital and why urbanist component is important. Social capital, okay, and that's it. That's what you listed up. That's all really fascinating. So, Robert, how do we start?
But yeah, that's a lot. Like, I
Mm.
guess like we're to start with a specific question. So yeah, I think that No Collapse is the real dystopia article. That's a good one to start. So I don't let me see if I can pull that up.
Okay.
I wrote that back in June,
Mhm.
and I have a more like recent economic article, the recent bullishness and why a hard landing is still inevitable. So let me go back to see. No collapse is the real dystopia, and I talk about like there are these like cycles of stagnation and cycles of collapse, and obviously cycles of prosperity, and this relates like stuff like Peter Turchin's scientific or mathematical research on these cycles of crises and like the fourth turning theory.
Okay, I don't
So
know these. I've never heard these. I know like Spengler's idea of cycles and that kind of cycle, but I'm sure it's is this a mathematical excuse for the same thing that things are cyclical
I think they're
civilizationally?
pretty similar. Yeah, cyclical. I think
Right.
Spengler's view is probably more. It's probably more philosophical. So yeah, Peter
Well,
Turchin
yeah.
uses
Okay. Go on.
some. He measures these different metrics. So, but just kind of looking over time, like the 2010s, there was something just like really kind of stagnant about it despite like some events, like there was like a recession at the beginning of the decade, and then different political movements, Occupy Wall Street, nationalism and populism on the rise in Europe, the Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders movements,
Mm-hmm.
and then like the Great Awakening really took off. And then looking specifically, I mean, looking specifically at this decade, obviously, like 2020 was a chaotic year with the pandemic, and then the riots in the summer, and just an overall acceleration of woke politics, cancel culture, and then certain moments that were feeling like really apocalyptic. And then I mentioned, like with the exception of say January 6th, 2021 actually felt like a kind of stagnant year. So you had
Right.
COVID was easing, and then there was the peak of of the pandemic stimulus bubble and the market euphoria, and that was kind of like propping up the economy. But I would say like that year, like the right felt totally demoralized, but like cancel culture had just become like the new normal. Then some returned to chaos in 2022 with the onset of inflation and the Ukraine war. And then this year earlier we had the banking crisis and debt default scare and a migrant crisis that really accelerated. and these different things overseas that seem to kind of flare up and then de-escalate, like the coup in Russia and all these different things, or like the riots in France. Like they seem like they're going to accelerate, but then they decelerate.
The coup in Russia. What the coup? I mean, I thought that was kind of
Or
an
failed
invented.
coup. I'd say it's not really a coup, but a coup attempt. And there's a lot of different speculations about that. Some are conspiratorial, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's just interesting, like these patterns of how like the news cycle. It is like so fast, and then the
Mhm.
stuff about the indictment of Trump and just political polarization. So yeah, like there is. I guess this summer does actually feel pretty stagnant. So like I wrote this in June, and there has been some changes since then, but just looking like specifically at the economy, so it seemed like you had like all this talk of like a soft landing and no recession, like bullishness, economic optimism from the establishment. Then it seemed that like the Silicon Valley bank crash would have put an end to all these hopes of economic recovery, but then that didn't pan out. Actually, like there has been like this summer there's been a huge like stock market bubble that I think is bigger. It's bigger than like past bubbles, including the .com bubble. Like there's this AI bubble, but there has been
Oh,
this
really?
kind of like bullishness and market optimism this summer, and that's despite like all the major vulnerabilities in the financial system, unprecedented levels of debt. Even though inflation, its rate is relatively low, but there still is this kind of sticky core inflation plus a kind of return to like the supply chain problems that have been resolved, and like these interest rates will have to be they're rising and they have to be sustained for a period of time. So I mean things actually do look pretty bleak for the economy, but there are just all these copes, like not even just now, like as we speak, like we're probably going to see like another soft landing article tomorrow morning.
See, I don't even follow those economic articles or any of that Wall Street type stuff. I do not speculate, and I don't. I assume that it's all kind of. I mean, I'm not sure if you would. So, from your point of like, is the Wall Street stuff and all that like, is that a symptom of larger forces, or is what happens with the economy and with the markets more telling as to what you would predict otherwise with in other more real life events like war and some of the other catastrophes you're talking about? Is that what you would say?
Well, I mean, it's all interconnected,
Right.
but the stock market is just not really. It's not a great metric for the health of the economy,
Okay.
because I think the best example of that was like it really shot off when during the height of the pandemic, and like one another example is actually like the stock market rallies when there's bad news. So bad news is good news for the economy, for the stock market, because that means, so let's just say unemployment goes up, that means that the Fed will have to pivot and cut back on interest rates, and that's what the stock market wants to hear. So actually, like good unemployment numbers, like those are actually bad for the stock market. The stock market, that is often the case.
Right. So, in relation to, so you're talking about cycles of things getting sort of hot and then getting quiet again, like little mini cycles. Is that
Yeah,
what
like
the
there's
article
these
is?
mini
Yeah.
cycles, so it's not like people tend to want to think about things in these big eras. Like there's a decade of prosperity, of stagnation and chaos, but it's these like little like these like micro cycles, like one how fast. And then this kind of gets in like with like Baudrillard's like simulation, how everything is like how we experience like the news cycles, but something big happens. So like the current thing, and obviously like right now it's the fire and the big disaster in Maui. That's a huge thing right now. But there's always they're all. I mean that's catastrophic, totally catastrophic. But it does always seem to be like a main thing in the news cycle.
Well, what? Yeah. So what's in the news cycle and what's really happening are kind of two different things, especially in America, I think. So, like to me, the biggest event, unquestionably, since it happened and will be ongoing, is the war. The fact that there's a low key, we're really in World War III officially, in a kind of weird low key way, very strange, lazy low key for us, not people in Ukraine or people in Russia and Ukraine on the front lines. It's not low key, I guess, but
Yeah, it's
that's a constant like that's a real like to be so much closer than we have been for so long to nuclear and the nuclear exchange and things like this. Like after so much time, And even then, it's something that you can quickly get bored of in the cycle, and people kind of like, oh, okay, next thing. It's not going away. It's there in the background. They've made a huge rift and a huge enemy, more of an enemy than they had, by starting this conflict. I mean, I don't know what you think, but I tend to blame America for starting that myself, and the UN and Vicky Nuland and that. But
I mean, I guess there's like there's different angles. So like from the standpoint, if you want to look at it like purely from like the non-aggression principle, then like Russia is the aggressor. But then you look at all these other like more intricate geopolitical factors and how the whole thing about the U.S. was pushing Ukraine to join NATO, and that really set Russia off. So there are these different complex like different angles, and it seems like both sides are kind of. It's not like there isn't like one clear winner. It's just kind of low intensity, like proxy war almost. So it's like I think they both have different motives. So they want to kind of grind down the other side. So the U.S. it is really kind of like it's so. I don't know if I'd call it a low intensity war. It is pretty. I mean, it's pretty intense and brutal, but it feels more like dragged out rather than accelerated. So the U.S. is trying to drag it out and to trying to just sort of gradually drain and weaken Russia. And then Russia's motive is they want to have Ukraine in this like long stage of kind of chaos to prevent them from just joining NATO and then being a staunch Western ally. So they're both the U.S. and both Russia have kind of some similar motives.
So they both want to drag it out. You think they both want to drag it out as long as possible?
I think that's what it seems like now. Like neither side, and I wrote an article on the war back in I think it was November of last year, almost a year ago, and basically like what I predicted has basically come true. But like if you look at territorial gains, like Russia controls this sphere of influence in the eastern part of Ukraine, Crimea, and then like eastern kind of like border lands, but there hasn't really been like there actually hasn't been like a dramatic shift in like the Russian land grab. Like some people were predicting that Russia would just take everything to the Dnieper River or up to Kiev, and like that hasn't really happened. It's been it's been a relatively consistent area, relative consistency as far as like who controls what. But I do think the one thing that is a huge game changer about this war is the supply chain issue. So they resolved this deal between Russia and Ukraine about grain, and now that's ended. And then Ukrainian drones have attacked like the Russian oil tankers and Russia's main port in the Black Sea. So there has been like just over the past several weeks to months, like there has been like a game changer as far as supply chain goes with both petroleum and with grain and like global food supply. And that's part of the reason that actually inflation went down and there was this talk of a soft landing was because there was a temporarily these supply chain issues did get temporarily resolved.
So so let's just like I'm so out of the loop on this stock market speculation stuff. I'm not even 100% sure what I mean. I kind of have an idea what a soft landing and a hard landing mean, but like, what is it? How does it really mean, or what do they mean in the big picture, or how do they play out? Like your first point that you said.
Well, I guess what they mean by a soft landing is the Fed pulling off this kind of like Goldilocks scenario where they're able to end inflation with the interest rates, but without crashing the economy. And I think that's complete nonsense. Like,
do you think there's going to be an end to inflation? How could they end inflation at this point?
Well, I mean, inflation could end, but it would take a really hard crash. Like, there's a whole, even with people who are like really, like on the side that are really bearish, obviously means very pessimistic with the economy. There is some division. There are people like Peter Schiff. I mean, I think all of those financial types, like those financial YouTubers, they all tend to be kind of like libertarian, Austrian economics types. But like Peter Schiff believes that there's going to be it's going to be an inflationary depression or a severe recession with inflation. And then there's also a lot of people who believe in a deflationary crash. So
worse, and they think it's going to be worse than the last real estate crash. And you think it's going to be tied up with real estate? You said it at one point, didn't you? Another real estate crash? Did you say it was?
I mean, residential, it's a bit. I mean, I think with residential, it's more nuanced because some areas there is very strong like organic demand. I think a lot of people, it's more likely that they're going to stay put rather than try to sell or
Right.
like maybe rent out like an extra room. So that's harder to say with residential. A lot depends, like a mortgage rates going up, but commercial real estate looks like a pretty catastrophic crash. Like the crash that
Commercial real
commercial
estate.
real estate
Okay.
is facing could end up being a lot worse than the overall real estate crash that happened in '08.
So yeah, okay. So your first point.
Then it has like a ripple effect, and that would take down a lot of the more of the regional banks.
So if that catastrophic event happens, that would be a difficult time that we, in your view, would fix inflation, basically.
Possibly it could cause an ease. Well, I guess specifically like there's like the core inflation, monetary inflation, and then there's these different there's like the CPI includes different like supply chain issues and commodities. So a real estate crash, yeah, that could bring down the cost of real estate, which is a form of. So I guess technically, if commercial real estate were to crash, then the market for commercial real estate would deflate. But whether that causes deflation for the entire economy is hard to say. It is possible that commercial real estate could crash, and other sectors of the economy and commodities could still inflate.
Because
So right
like
now, the big thing to watch is those supply chain issues revolving around like the war
yeah,
in Ukraine and things like food supply, and I think especially like OPEC is cutting oil production, so oil prices are most likely what could cause a rise in inflation. And then also there's been like the when the Fed first raised interest rates, it really strengthened the dollar, and that did help bring down inflation a bit. But any event where there's a weakening of the dollar, and including like mass selling off of treasury bonds, that could cause inflation to resurge.
right. So like, and forget my naive questions about this stuff because I don't know it as well as you in regards markets and things. But so like I don't see the what would you say is the main source of the current inflation?
The
The main
main the main
reasons for it.
source there's side issues like supply chain, but I think the amount of spending is unprecedented. So let me just I have the statistics on my article. Let me see if I can pull it up. But something I think it's like 40%. Let me just pull that up. So it's really the size of the money supply. So the money supply change. Okay, so I'll give like some overview from my recent article. So the
Yeah.
Fed did reduce its balance sheet only by 8% since its peak. So the money
Yeah.
supply, so basically the money supply is still twice the size that it was pre-COVID. So that's taking into account that about 40% of all money in circulation was printed in just the last 1.5 years, which is unprecedented.
Right.
And the U.S. is still spending about 44% of the GDP per year, which is similar to World War II levels. And then you have like the M2 money supply, their growth rate that has gone negative this year, contracting at the fastest rate since the Great Depression. Though the money supply did expand again recently after contracting. So the M2 money supply increased while the Fed's balance sheet decreased, which can be explained by so basically the Fed has been shrinking its assets and selling off bonds, which is called quantitative tightening. But then at the same time, also doing targeted bailouts of the banks. So the M2 money supply is the entire national money supply. Well, the Fed's balance sheet is very specific. So the Fed is still like they're purchasing bonds from corporations such as Apple and Disney. So that's actually been propping up the stock market, and then just like the overall high
Disney.
levels of spending. But the thing is, like like a rapid expansion of the money supply, but then also contracting sharply, that's extremely volatile.
Right. Okay. So they've been printing money and doing all this horseshit they've been doing for a long time, and it's just getting worse and catching up with them. This is what I've thought and observed, and
Yeah, basically.
right. So that's an ongoing thing. They weren't able to nip that in the bud back when they were, functioning better, and it didn't have a war going on. So now they got the war on top of it. They made this. They made a really much more of an outright enemy, violent enemy, with the other half of the world in the east. There, it's not just Russia. There's other China and other places. So I can't see them. I just don't see some scenario where they just we figure we'll do some little trick and we'll just recover and there's no more inflation. Boom. I can't imagine some scenario where that's going to happen.
Yeah, that's just incredibly naive. The people who believe that, but I think it's really just like the sheer levels of debt that are what's going to take down the economy. Like that can't be. It's like this.
Well, that's
it's
that was your first
fast-
point. That was your first point. Signs of hard landing mostly due to debt. So it was the debt.
That's the key point. If you have to really like simplify it, that's what you should. That's what has to be emphasized.
Right. Okay. So the debt, and then plus the war. So you would agree then they're not very likely to turn that around and stop that inflation. So
Because interest on the national debt just reached. Let me just double check, but I'm pretty sure it just reached like 1 trillion, like 1 trillion a year. And that's just to pay off. Yeah, 1 trillion a year interest in the national debt. That's surging 50% in just the past year, and that's unprecedented. And interest rates will soon account for over 20% of all government expenditures, which is higher than national defense spending. And this will only accelerate as rates rise or at least have to be sustained. And then over the next 10 years, the Congressional Budget Office, they project that interest costs are going to hit 10.6 trillion. So yeah, like you get to a scenario like the Fed may just give up fighting inflation and then actually inflate the dollar to pay off the debt. So that's really the scenario where inflation would surge again. Then you also have to kind of factor in like shorter term, if when we go into this like recession over the next year, and especially considering we're going to an election year, like they're really going to try to aggressively like prop up this economy, which means like more stimulus. So that means like short term we may actually see another recovery, and I think this election, doing it before the election, is crucial. So we may actually see like another kind of short term like sign of an economic recovery, but then that would cause another massive wave of inflation. Then that would cause the Fed having to raise.
As long as it's after the election, that's all right. As long as it's after the election.
Yeah, so it's right. like I didn't put this in the article, but I'm saying like things may appear fine for now, but if I actually think we're going to see like a huge crash like sometime after the election. So it could be anywhere from like December to 2024 to sometime like in spring, like the spring or even summer of 2025. Like that could be like when things really crash hard.
Okay, that's very specific. That's good. That's a good courageous prediction. So according to what my gist of what you're saying, you would predict possibly a temporary sign of recovery, and then after the election you expect a hard landing due to debt and an increase in inflation as well as the hard landing. So that's got to be fairly catastrophic to have the hard landing with no indication of any way of a future recovery. No, if people get that kind of panic.
It's obviously a future recovery at some point, but I'm saying like in the first, at some point in the future, but it's going to have to be bad for at least for quite some time. And
well, that's
one thing to add is like it's not just the United States, like other nations. It's a global problem. Like China,
it is. Yeah.
They're having a crisis, and the government is probably like they're significantly downplaying it, even much worse than the U.S. is. Even so, the U.S. actually does have advantages over other nations. It's not like there's some narrative where that says America is totally screwed while the rest of the world is going to like rise up, and like that I don't really buy into that. I think it's like it's a global crisis with America actually having even despite like signs of a weakening in the dollar, still having tremendous leverage economically over other nations.
Right. Well, I can say here in Europe, for instance, like in terms of things like real estate, like there's a lot of building going on. Most of it is like really shitty, globalist building to house people as there's a housing crisis, but a lot of it is, of course, people refugees, especially now related to the war, the Ukrainian refugees, which are being put up in hotels. Hotels are full, and places are being built to house them, and there's tons and tons of money going into it.
Well, that's
Like
yeah,
bottomless
that's
pits of
happening.
money. I found a friend, like a normie type tier friend of mine today, who happens to work at a hotel, was telling me how much money the hotels are getting paid just to fill up their rooms with Ukrainian refugees. I was like, oh my god, like how can the government just hand out this sum of money for this? Where's it coming from? How is that sustainable? You're gonna, there's housing and building crisis here, and in terms of inflationary rates, like normal people cannot afford like a basic house of any kind anymore, and it's getting worse and worse. Very much so here, I can say
Yeah,
that.
there's happening this there's this migrant crisis here, and it's having a really dramatic impact on New York. It hasn't really been that significant in California, but I'd say yet it could very well be. But the big dramatic impact has been in New York and Chicago, Boston to some degree, but California has been much less impacted, which is kind of ironic considering you've traditionally been like a major source for immigration. But essentially, one thing I pointed out in the recent economics article.
Is that where you live, California? Is that your
Yeah,
native?
I live in
No, no, no.
California. What's
Right, right.
interesting is with the economics article is so like the whole like soft Bidenomics economic strategy really hedges upon migration. So
Mhm.
what it does is it grows, it props up, so like mass immigration, it props up real estate. It it keeps like the GDP growth sustained, but then it also does like wage and it solves the issue of wage inflation because mass migration undercuts wages, and then that solves the issue of wage inflation. So it's bad as far as like a lot of just basic quality of life issues, but it actually like mass migration at the border has the effect of actually assisting with like good economic data, making the economic data look good.
Right. Sorry, my microphone just collapsed on me. 1 sec. Yeah. So, and that was actually one of your points. Do I sound okay? Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, good. Was you mentioned as a talking point demographic change in California? Was that related to what you were just saying, or like because California already underwent a massive transformation, I
Well,
think,
it's interesting
from
is
immigration, right?
like with talking about it, it's sort of a gift. It's a more kind of there's like general and more specific, but I get the feeling that like California already underwent its like big transformation from it's from like the 80s to like the first decade of the 2000s, like the zeros, and there's some sense like things don't seem to be changing as dramatically anymore. Like it's a more they're changing, but some sense like even though like there is like an exodus and a number of different demographic trends, I feel like these other states like Texas, Georgia, Virginia, like they're undergoing like really rapid change, and California doesn't I'm not really feeling like things don't feel that dramatically different than they did like 10 to 15 years ago demographically. But they are changing, just not, but it's nothing like these other states.
So it's not so much the demographics in California as the bizarre new laws about you're allowed to shoplift and age of consent laws and things like this.
Yeah, there's a lot of craziness. Like I haven't really been seeing it really. I mean, it really depends. What depends where you go. Like homelessness has gone way up. Like shoplifting seems to have been going way up. I don't know. Like violent crime. Like I don't. I'm not sure. I have to double check this, but like the murder rate, things like the murder rate, I'm not sure if it's really going up that dramatically. I think it's about property crime, like auto thefts, and these videos like the sideshows, and just seems like the really more kind of like petty crime, like decay, just like urban decay, like that's really going up. But it does again, it
We
does
keep
seem to
passing. It
be.
seems like a hotspot. It seems like the place in the world where they really test out the uber liberal approach to civic law and stuff. Like they test out these bizarre laws. Well, at least as far as I know, maybe I'm reading like exaggerated headlines, but I just keep hearing, "Oh, California passes law, this and that," and it just sounds like utterly insane. Like, and it's always California. I don't know. I just
But it's others. It's not just California, like New York
right.
too.
Well, New York
It's
is bad too, but California seems a bit more extreme. From what I'm just judging from like seeing my news feed and seeing like, oh, California's doing this and that. It just always seems very extreme from California. But I mean, it's a historically very extremely liberal place, I guess.
yeah, for sure.
And so that whatever the changes and the crime and the problems have not changed the mind of the average Californian too much. You would be very much in a minority there with your wacky right wing
Yeah,
views.
you would think a lot of people are ambivalent. Like a lot of because like Newsom did pretty well. He seems to be like there's been some decline in his approval rating, but he's actually like I remember during when the recall, a lot of people said he was like politically vulnerable, but that was felt like that was kind of a cope, and he's actually
Okay.
seen as a pretty formidable. Like yeah, I think the chance of him running in this year is very slim. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think he's a very formidable candidate for 2028. And I think
Okay.
someone on Twitter said like he's sort of like he's the perfect person for a kind of successful like managed decline.
Is that how you feel, California? Your home state is a
Yeah,
test
pretty
tube for a
much.
managed decline, pretty much. And that's all we can do is say, okay, yeah, managed decline, right?
But yeah,
That's
that's
okay.
more so than actual. Yeah, it seems to be like it's more been that kind of like slow, gradual decline, like frog in the boiling pan, than any kind of like really dramatic like collapse.
Yeah. So some people in my chat were spurging out and saying, "Oh, this guy talks like a Valley girl," but it's like this man is from
Okay,
California. This man is from California.
right.
He's from the actual Valley where the Valley girls got their accents. It's not his fault.
I go to the
Is that?
yeah, I go. I mean, I don't I don't live in the valley, but I mean, I go there to visit a friend quite often.
I know, but the Valley girl was really for those of us who aren't American and live around the world. I mean, I'm Canadian, right? So, but I mean, it's been the same everywhere, and it was really an essentially Californian kind of style accent that caught on, that became evolved into I think what we call the upspeak now, which is a real kind of weird exaggeration of that. But it really was originally a Californian way of speaking, the Valley Girl talk that
Yeah, it's
the
interesting.
girls kind
Like
of talked
yeah,
about.
upspeak is really. I mean, I think actually think it's weird because like the Valley Girl was more associated. That was like LA of the 80s and 90s, and there's a
Mm.
specific kind of like upspeak that is stereotypically associated with like a lot of women in the corporate world today. A
But it
more
was
like
similar. It was a similar kind of like, oh my
yeah, it's
god,
influence.
gag me with
Yeah,
a spoon kind of thing, like right. I remember all
like
that shit.
you sort of say every word is like a question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's where it came from. So California speak, particularly of females, became an archetype, became like a symbol around the world, around the Western world, for how basically how I think mostly ladies want to speak or something. I don't know, like a
It's interesting because
sort of a
I also heard
social
somewhere
status
that
thing.
some of it originated in like the upper Midwest, like Minnesota. Who knows?
Maybe, but I mean, originally it was called the Valley Girl Talk. I remember that when pretty similar to what we call the upspeak today.
Right.
But I was something I was going to ask you there about the debt, the crash and the debt and everything. And what was it? Shit, I lost it now. Crap. What was it? So okay, no, it's actually more to do with what the other thing we brought up that you said, which was the overarching point, which I'd like to ask you about the details of what you think about this. Why no collapse is the real dystopia? Now I can guess why, but tell us what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much like there's just so much like pounded into that, but it's this very like demoralizing process where people just get used to a gradual a gradual lower quality of life, but it's not like these people who romanticize the collapse as some exciting historical event where there's a sense of I think the key is like in a sense there's like an opportunity for like heroism, and that's kind of is like it's like for the doomer that's kind of a cope. But what it's been like for the future, I think I don't. It's hard to say if it will just be this like continued slow gradual decline. I think we will see some really major catastrophic events just because so many things that are happening like politically that are way beyond of like any like notion of normalcy by late 20th century standards. So I think we will see, like, I do think history and events will be very interesting, but so far there has been, the trend has really been more of this kind of like slow gradual decline and stagnation.
Right. And would you think the likelihood of anything nuclear happening? Would you say slim? I mean, it's pretty.
Oh,
It would be
between
pretty
the
insane.
U.S. and Russia, I think if it were to happen, it would be totally catastrophic. But I don't
Yeah,
think
that's
it's the
easy.
most likely. I don't think it's the most likely scenario. It's one of the
Yeah.
things. If it does, just a small likelihood is still is still pretty disturbing, or something to be concerned about in its own right, because
Right.
the implications. But I guess
Like if one side
what I
it
what
becomes
would I predict happening?
if one side is really visibly losing without a chance to save face, is that not the most dangerous? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
if
I mean, I'm saying
especially
it's not.
yeah.
I guess one scenario might be that Ukraine is losing and Ukraine gets a missile from that's American, and then they use like a missile or a drone, and they attack. They take out like a small Russian city, and then Russia retaliates and drops a nuke on
Mm.
Ukraine, on a major city. Then that escalates. But that's not the most likely scenario. I think what will happen is that this war will kind of continue as it is now, this kind of slow, dragged out conflict. And then I also expect like a series of like proxy wars between the U.S. and the West, NATO, and Russia and China, all throughout the world, including like Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. I mean,
Right.
that scenario is much more likely.
I
Like
think particularly in
it
Africa,
is like
Africa.
you could say it's like World War III, but
Yeah.
it's World War III that's more like a series of like a bunch of like smaller proxy wars kind of spread out throughout the world.
Well, that's almost like World War I, right? And except for the,
Right, right.
it was sort of like that, but there was major battles in the Somme and all the rest of it. But yeah, yeah. So that's interesting. So, um, no collapse is the real dystopia because it just means that the trash world just carries on and gets trashier and trashier, right?
Yeah, correct.
So that's the obvious thing for everybody. So you would in your heart of hearts ultimately hope for this bullish, or sorry, for this hard landing, with the inflation thing sort of. Like what's the in combination with the ongoing war? Like how is that going to say if America is really struggling financially, etc.
Oh, you're
You
saying
know,
kind of like passive. It's like I think acceleration is like a really kind of like dirty word, and it's associated with things that are dangerous and extreme. But like there's this idea of associated. It's associated with like Curtis Yarvin of being like a passive accelerationist. Like you just sort of sit back and watch it unfold. Maybe you passive aggressively hope for a collapse, but you're not engaged like that. That's kind of a thing. So yeah, like but the thing is like if you don't have like I guess the point is like if you don't really have control over what's going to happen, like what's the point in really like wishing for something? I think it's better. It's healthier just to not be like overly emotionally invested and just be a kind of like passive observer. But
yeah,
it is kind of I mean I really I get it because like hearing the kind of back and forth between we might have a collapse, a soft landing, and this like slow gradual decline, like it gets pretty I don't know, kind of I mean kind of boring, but it's like I guess if you're just like a regular like if you're kind of a regular person who just wants to kind of live your life, or if you do this as like a living or or something you're not a living or a hobby or just someone you're passionate about, then maybe if you feel more of a more stronger connection. But it is like it does it is very like very kind of like stagnant. And but again, like I think the 2020s, like going back to like Peter Turchin's research in the fourth turning, I think we're going to see like a historically unprecedented event.
okay,
I mean, we sort of have to some degree, but it's like this. I think it's like 90. Maybe it's the fourth turning is like 90 years. So you kind of look at Anglo-American history. It was the British Civil War, and then the American Revolutionary War, the American Civil War, World War II / Great Depression. And then if you think it's like 90 years, then we should be hitting the next big thing sometime this decade.
yeah. It feels like death and destruction are on the wind. Frankly,
Right, right. And
you
I
can
think like
smell it in the
some
air.
people say like we're gonna have like a civil war, but it's more
Uh,
like kind of a low intensity like civil strife, like in
yeah,
Northern Ireland, like something like that is
yeah,
was more
just like
likely.
generally, yeah, just a general increase in sort of chaos like that. Yeah,
Like
I
with
would agree
this
with that.
next election, like it's going to be like ugly regardless who wins, because both sides are going to accuse the other of stealing the election. So if Biden wins by a narrow margin, then the Trump side will get militant and say the election was stolen. But if Trump wins, then the left is just going to totally flip out, and there could very well be like riots, and it could be much more
Yeah,
chaotic. So either who wins is going to be. But I actually do think if like I don't bet on the elections, but if I had to guess, I actually do think Biden's more likely to win because the demographic changes and the advantage of like institutional capture. But I think Trump is at a huge disadvantage, and especially like being under investigation. But there is still a chance he could he could win if the economy really tanks hard before the election. So
right,
Biden is much more likely to win, but Trump could win if the economy really tanks.
right. Well, I don't see much. I don't see. I don't honestly think there'll be a massive difference between them. There'll be less transsexuals with Trump, and like a few things will be nicer. But overall, I think they both, for whatever happened with Trump when he won the first time. I mean, you were around then too, right? He didn't seem to be able to do a hell of a lot. It's like they get in
No,
there and
no,
they get in there and they kiss the ring
it's
and
like pretty
they take their orders
conventional.
whoever they're.
He pretty much governed as a pretty conventional conservative with like
Yeah, just
tax
useless
cuts,
shit, nothing.
deregulations, but then also like he also did like the Fed printing to stimulate the economy. So
Yeah, and he bombed Syria and stuff like that. It wasn't as promised, let's say, right? So it seems like they have it cinched up. Whoever gets in there. So I don't personally care much about that. And what you're saying about
I guess
accelerationism,
the only thing is like I think things will be bad regardless if it's Biden or Trump. I don't think
mm,
the huge distinction, but I do actually think if Trump is president and things are really bad, then that will just further energize the establishment and the left. Well, if there's another term of Biden or Kamala Harris gets in there, then actually you could then that would push energy more about I don't know, like maybe the right would be more demoralized or more energized. It's actually hard to say, maybe a bit of both, because it's like the right was like really demoralized in 2021, but then now they seem to be like really energized again. And you
are
have
they
like
though?
different,
We exist in certain circles on
but
the
it's
internet. I don't
symbolically,
in real life though.
it's like they're energized, but it's symbolically like it's like the new country song North of Richmond. Like everything the right does is like it's a symbolism. That's how it feels.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. But it's not necessarily so widespread or effective amongst the actual living
No,
mass
not really. Like
of the society.
you look at the last like midterm election. Like usually the incumbent is at a the incumbent's party is at a disadvantage. It was like really close. Like the Republicans did pathetically the last midterm.
Yeah, and I expect. Yeah, I don't know. Like I say, Trump is probably their best chance, anyways. Whatever, but I don't expect much from any of that. I wouldn't pay any attention to the American election. It doesn't. It literally has no meaning for me anymore. I just want to touch like on what you said about what's it called, acceleration, because I would often these days I would call myself an acceleration. It's not. It just like there's different ways to look at that or approach it. And I'm pretty sure I heard that term before Yarvin as well, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think Garvin's like he's called like a passive accelerationist.
Passive accelerations. I just see it like say I feel like it's inevitable in many ways. That this fall this decline, and there's so few signs of being able to escape it, or certainly very little sign of being able to reverse it in any meaningful way. As everything like in so many ways, and almost every way, things sort of dissipate and get worse. It feels like, and there's so many forces and competing elements like flooding in and surging to tear everything apart even more fiercely. So I feel like you begin to feel like it's a matter of time. And so like there's when you like maybe there's people that yearn for it and they like, get on with it, and they think they're going to like impose then their way of the world immediately or whatever. And I don't believe that's how it works either. But I do have a certain feeling of like get on with it when it feels so inevitable. and it is to do with the, like if America's going through
Oh,
what
you're
Rome,
saying if
what if it,
something, it's like if something bad is going to happen, like it's better to get it over with than to kind of delay
yeah,
it. Yeah.
if it's absolutely inevitable. Say
Well, with
if
the
America's
economy, I
if
guess.
America, let me just finish. Let me just finish. If America's performing what Rome did, for say, for an example, right? And there's every indication it is. Like say the whole last Rome went on for like 100 years too long when it was just, pretty much over and hopeless, right? And this is even worse now because this is a weird technocratic sterilizing children, pretty insane society we're living in here right now. And if it has the potential to go on for another, it could end in 10 years, it could end in 200 years, but it's headed for the same result. So in a certain sense, I kind of feel like just get the fuck on with it. I'm tired of,
So
you
like
don't want
yeah,
to, you don't want to live, you don't want to survive. Fine. Just
and those
end
are
yourself.
those are the two different, totally different things. Like when you're thinking about like the American Empire, that's a much longer thing. Like the American Empire, just looking at like Rome, like how long it took for Rome to fall, took like a couple hundred years or longer. So like the American Empire could last another 100 years in some form, but they like the economy. That's a different thing. So that's a
Well,
short
how's
term
that? How
issue.
okay? The economy is a different. Oh, so the economy is short term no matter what. The economy is going to fail, and that is going to bring about fairly massive change.
Well, yeah,
You
like the
think is
economy
that the
could
way?
fail, but there could be some economic revival in a decade. So that's
Right.
even with like a weakening dollar, like America does have, it could revive itself with it has enough energy and like food supply to revive itself at some point. So that's but like short term, the thing is like with the economy, like the longer it's delayed, the worse the crash will be. So maybe there could have been if the Fed dealt with inflation earlier, there could have been a more generic recession. But the longer they delay it, the worse it's going to be.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, that's all. That all makes sense. But like, there's the. I guess my point that I just wanted to make was that there's two types of accelerations. There's the ones that yearn for it, thinking they're going to get their way when it all happens, which I'm not. But then there's one like me that's. It sounds more doomy because you're like, oh, it's hopeless. Get on with it. But there is like when things can only improve in a way if you live in a society like this, a sort of technocratic trash world place that's only going to get more worse. It's going to get more autocratic and more what's the word like paranoid and just more chaotic as it goes and violent and difficult to deal with. So it's sort of like, why extend that for as long as possible? And when you reach the point where it's over, surely it will be for even directly afterwards, it will be even worse. It'll be totally chaotic, like something I can't even imagine what it would be like. I don't know. What's the scenario where America sort of gives up and backs in the towel? What happens? I don't know. Um, Something even more crazy. But hey, at least it's not boring. How about that? It'd be boring.
Yeah,
It would be
yeah.
most boring. It would be most boring as if the world presented to us, the corporate world presented to us by television advertisements, just went on forever, and that was the reality
Well, yeah,
forever.
like
That
the
would be
end
the
of history
worst.
concept, basically.
Yeah. And we're just living in the pods, eating the bugs and all that. Like that would be the worst.
I think like I have to go pretty soon, but
Oh dear.
one
Okay.
thing I do want to kind of touch on is I think you have this in the notes, like the article about like architecture. So like
All right. Yeah.
despite like all this like chaos going on and like the signs of the economy, I've noticed like a vibe shift in the culture, and even in things like aesthetics and interior design, where in
Okay.
the 2010s like everything was very like the sterile minimalism and everything like was really kind of gray and demoralizing. And I have actually like noticed like a vibe shift where there is this kind of, even if it's unfounded, this new sense of exuberance where people are glad that the pandemic is over and people are out traveling and like just like the color palette that you see in like interior design and architecture, and just sort of like vacation themed like interior design, and lots of like the color, like lots of pink, turquoise, like also like scents are back, like more and more kind of like perfumey scents in public, and this kind of like, even if it's unfounded, like there is this kind of new sense of like neo like optimism.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I didn't notice that. I know I can't speak for America because I can only know the trends here. For like, it seemed like at least 20 years, the trend was to be sort of like cream and beige with a live, laugh, love sign on the wall. And I didn't see any indication of that getting better. But maybe there's always some people doing good stuff, sort of against the grain. And
I mean,
yeah,
I don't know. Like, it's kind of open. Like, if you want to say it's a positive trend, or you can say it's bullshit. It's kind of open to interpretation. But like, I think like the architecture article, like it's almost like it's like a shift back to postmodernism, and or there's the new fad like having like in that art. I don't know if you have that article with you right now, but the new fad is having like plants, like lots of like green walls and like lots of plants, where like
oh
each
yeah,
floor
yeah.
feels like a nursery or like a
Right, yeah.
floral shop.
Yeah, that was always good though. I mean, that was never a time when that wasn't a good trend to have. That
It
was
is
like in the
good,
old
but
days. If you look at old Victorian photos, every room would have a nice fern in it and a
right,
nice
right.
little.
I
And that
think I
was
mentioned that that's where the influence is kind of from. Or
right,
80s
and
mall,
that
like 80s malls, kind of even.
yeah, 80s malls. Well, that was kind of continuation of a 70s interior design thing where everywhere it would have plants, often the same kind of
Right,
ferns.
right.
That was a real 70s 60s thing. Even in bathrooms, you'd have little potted plants all along the place, which is great. Yeah, you should always greenery in the house is such a great idea. Yeah. And in fact, looking around me, we don't have very much in here. I should really do something about that.
Oh
We did
yeah.
have a nice fucking fern, but what happened? I think the kids killed it somehow or something. Whatever. But yeah, it's a good idea. It's a great idea. And do not, for the love of God, never use plastic plants. You can always tell. There's nothing more depressing than a plastic plant. You can sense it. You can see it. You come up close to it, and you just want to immediately commit seppuku.
For people who get like plastic Christmas trees.
Yeah, that's shit. Don't use plastic. Avoid plastic is a major problem in the modern world. Like it's everywhere. Most people don't notice it. Don't care. It really has a. It's something that didn't exist. It wasn't so prevalent in the past, and to have so
There's
many
like
things either made
toxins,
of
like
or wrapped in plastic.
microplastics, like getting into the food supply is a huge problem.
Oh, the babies are born now with microplastic inside them. Do you know that?
Oh yeah.
It's like it went from like it appearing in people's stomachs and lungs. Now babies are born with it. So we cannot. We've plasticked ourselves to death. We live in the plastic age. There's the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We live in the plastic age. And there's no sign in all this talk and everything we're saying. This is a whole new. That's a whole other side issue, a parallel doomsday thing. Is this related to the global shipping, especially like because all the food gets wrapped in it and everything? It's all to do with freshness and packaging and stuff.
It
But
is petroleum, so maybe if there is like an oil supply issue, like peak oil, maybe people will use less plastic. Who knows like how expensive it becomes, like that's hard to predict. But like peak oil is another thing. Like I think it will be an issue, but it's like much. I think like James Howard Kunstler is famous for talking about that, but it will be a huge issue. But like, who knows how long that will be? Like it could be like 50 years from now, or it could be sooner.
yeah, and I actually strongly suspect. I don't know how it is in America. Like, do they show? Like, I'm sure same as in Europe. You have your normal bin, your normal garbage bin, and your recycling bin, right? Like, what do they do with the recycling bin that's different? I know they used to here in Europe send it on boats to China, and then China got caught just dumping it in the ocean. Like,
Yeah, that's a huge problem. Yeah.
yeah, I feel like now it just goes in the same landfill as the other bin, and it's all a big ruse, or maybe some other landfill somewhere else.
That could be very well be true.
I really don't think. And when I consider the stuff that actually goes into our recycling bin, it's we're a busy family here, and it's not like pure or clean plastic all the time.
Because
I just wonder.
people don't clean it. They
Yeah,
just they throw it in
yeah,
dirty. So like how much of it? Maybe some of
yeah.
it they reuse, but I wonder if it's
I mean, I
more
try to
about.
clean it. I try to clean it, but even then, it's not perfectly clean. So I can only imagine other people that don't even can barely tell
I
the difference.
wonder if like recycling, how much of it is to make people feel like they're doing something
Yeah,
good.
I wonder. I really do wonder.
Like you
In this
mentioned
world,
that whole thing. It's like China or Southeast Asian nations, like they take plastic from the United States or other Western nations, they just dump it in the ocean. Now these like giant plastic islands in the middle of the Pacific.
the Pacific Ocean Gyre, yeah, that's a
Right.
fucking disaster. Like, imagine that. And the WWF and the climate change weepers never even talk about this. Hardly, anyways. It's not on their list of major things. I do want to say, Rick D says, I only recycle aluminum and paper. I shit can everything else. Yeah, well, that's yeah, and paper, like something like paper. When something's made out of paper, or even
Well,
like
paper
aluminum or wood.
absorbs. The thing is, like paper, you can't clean it. It absorbs all kinds of like dirt and like grime from food.
Yeah. But even if you throw
Maybe newspaper you can, but like paper from like food you can't. But I mean, at least paper is biodegradable. Plastic's
exactly,
not.
yeah, yeah, you can throw paper in the other in the normal waste bin too, and you don't give a shit because you know it's going to break down and there's no problem. Like it can go anywhere. It's just if they would just simply stop using plastic so much, but that doesn't enter into the possibility. You ever notice that's not possible. You cannot
Right.
you cannot truly suggest that. For whatever reason, plastic is really important to them, and I don't know why exactly, but maybe it's simply that normal people really do love the idea of freshly wrapped in plastic and sealed in plastic. I don't know. I'm not sure what it is, but listen, we covered most of your points, and I know you got to go. Did we miss it? Oh, there's one. Okay, let me ask one. Your very last point: rebuilding social capital and why urbanist component is important. Do you have something quick to say about that?
Yeah, I'll just touch on that really briefly. So yeah, like social capital. I think it will be like Robert Putnam has his book like Bowling Alone. It will have to. It's cyclical again. Like it's this whole thing like atomization. It's not forever. Like crises will force people to rebuild social capital, but a lot of it is I don't have like a whole lot in detail to say, but like the urban structure is a huge, really impacts how people live and how interact with each other. So it is true like car oriented suburbia contributes to atomization, and then urban areas have a lot of problems with like the urban decay and like rising crime. So if people are going to rebuild like social capital and communities, like they should really consider like what is the best kind of structure to rebuild in, and both like in a grandiose sense, but as well as like more modest like practical sense, and like the rule of like public spaces and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with that. Yep. And so I guess we've reached our conclusion. Yeah, we had a good rundown of your
Well, great,
predictions.
yeah, great show. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I mean, it's great to. Oh, again, I'm sure you'll be lurking on the internet somewhere, and you'll surprise me popping up somewhere, some corner of it. Oh, there's Robert Stark again. What's he going to say this time? And it's good to see you're out there.
Yeah, great, great show.
Pushing
Thanks
ideas.
again.
Okay.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And that's it. So, goodbye. Rick D says, "Fucking plastic wrapped bananas."